My dad abandoned me 20 years ago, then came back asking me to adopt his 7-year-old son so he could date without baggage. I refused and called CPS instead. I never thought I'd hear from my father again after he walked out on my mom and me when I was just 6 years old. Back then, my whole world shattered overnight. One moment, he was there, a tall figure with a booming laugh and the smell of aftershave that clung to my clothes when he hugged me. The next moment, he was gone, vanished, like someone had erased him from my life with a cruel flick of a pen. I remember the night he left vividly. It was raining hard, the kind of heavy downpour that made the streets look like rivers. I've been sitting on the couch with my favorite blanket, waiting for him to come home from work so we could have our Friday movie night. Instead, I heard the muffled sound of my parents arguing in the kitchen. I was too young to understand every word, but I caught phrases like, "I can't do this anymore," and "I'm sorry, but I have to go." Then the front door slammed, and my father's shadow disappeared into the night. That was the last time I saw him for 20 years. The days after that were a blur of confusion and silence. My mom tried her best to hold everything together. She worked double shifts at a diner, came home exhausted, and still made sure I had dinner on the table and a roof over my head. But the absence was heavy. No phone calls, no birthday cards, not a single "how's my kid doing" from the man who was supposed to be my father. Growing up without him was like walking with one shoe missing. Everything felt uneven. At school events, I'd watch other kids' dads cheer for them at soccer games or carry them on their shoulders at the fair, and I'd wonder what that felt like. On Father's Day, I'd make a card at school because the teacher told us to, but instead of giving it to someone, I'd hide it in a shoebox under my bed. That shoebox filled up over the years. Each card a tiny, unspoken wish for a dad who cared. By the time I turned 18, I'd accepted that he was just gone. He'd chosen to erase me from his life, and the best thing I could do was erase him from mine. I worked hard, went to college, and eventually built a decent life for myself. I had a small apartment, a steady job, and a circle of friends who felt more like family than my actual blood relatives. My mom was still my rock, and we'd occasionally talk about him in passing, usually with a shrug or a bitter laugh. Then, one random Tuesday afternoon, everything changed. My phone buzzed with an unknown number. Normally, I don't answer calls I don't recognize, but something made me pick it up. "Hello," I said. There was a pause, and then a voice I hadn't heard in 2 decades said, "It's me, your dad." I froze. My brain scrambled to process the words. My dad? The man who'd left me standing in the living room with my blanket all those years ago? I didn't know whether to hang up, scream, or laugh. But before I could decide, he kept talking. "I know it's been a long time," he said, his tone oddly casual, like we were old friends who just lost touch. "But I really need to talk to you. It's important." I should have hung up right there. I should have told him he had no right to ask me for anything after 20 years of silence. But curiosity, no, maybe it was some twisted leftover hope, made me stay on the line. We agreed to meet at a small cafe downtown. The whole ride there, my stomach churned. I didn't know what he wanted, but I had a feeling it wasn't going to be an apology. And I was right. When I walked in and saw him sitting at a corner table, older but still recognizable, I thought maybe, just maybe, he'd say he was sorry, that he'd explain himself. But within minutes, I realized this wasn't about me at all. It was about him. What he asked me that day was so absurd, so selfish that I nearly laughed in his face. And yet, it was just the beginning of the mess I was about to get dragged into. When I sat down at that cafe table, I wasn't sure what I expected. Maybe some long overdue apology. Maybe a half-baked explanation for why he'd left me and my mom to fend for ourselves. But instead, my father leaned back in his chair like no time had passed at all and gave me this tight little smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You look just like your mother," he said, almost like it was an insult. I didn't answer. I just stared at him, taking in the lines on his face, the gray streaks in his hair, the way his hands fidgeted on the table. He looked older, obviously, but also smaller somehow, like life had whittled him down. After an awkward silence, he cleared his throat. "I'm not going to pretend I was a good father," he said. "Things happened. I made mistakes. That was it. No real explanation. No, I'm sorry." Just a vague acknowledgement before he shifted the conversation toward himself, as if 2 decades of abandonment could be brushed aside with a few words. He started talking about his life since he left, how he'd moved across the country, had a few relationships, a few jobs, and eventually found stability. I sat there, listening but not really hearing. My mind kept flashing back to my mom, working herself to exhaustion, and to all those Father's Days where I made cards for no one. The disconnect between his story and my reality made my skin crawl. Then he dropped it, the real reason he'd called me. "I have a son," he said. "Your half-brother. His name's Liam. He's 7. I blinked. I didn't even know what to say. My father had a whole other kid, and this was the first I was hearing about it. "That's nice," I said flatly, unsure where this was going. He leaned forward, lowering his voice like we were discussing some big secret. I need you to adopt him. I actually laughed at first. I thought it was some kind of bad joke, but his face stayed deadly serious. Why on earth would I do that? I asked. Well, he began. I'm seeing someone. A really great woman, but she doesn't want to date a man with a young kid. So I was thinking, if you adopted Liam legally, then it wouldn't be my responsibility anymore. You could take care of him, and I could still be in his life, just not full-time. I stared at him in disbelief. So you want me to take custody of your child so you can have a girlfriend? He had the audacity to nod. You're his sister. Family should help family. I felt my jaw clench. The irony of him preaching about family after abandoning me was almost laughable. Family helps family, I repeated, but you couldn't even bother to send me a birthday card for 20 years? He sighed, as if I was the one being unreasonable. I know you're angry, but Liam's a good kid. He needs stability, and you've got your life together. Plus, your blood. Who else would do this for him? The way he framed it, like I was selfish for not immediately agreeing, made my stomach turn. I wasn't even sure what my legal rights were in a situation like this, but I knew one thing. Adopting a child isn't like lending someone a sweater. It's permanent. It's life-changing. And the fact that he was using his own son as a bargaining chip so he could date someone freely was beyond disgusting. Still, a part of me thought about Liam. This kid had no say in any of this. He was just collateral damage in my father's selfishness, just like I had been all those years ago. That thought made something tighten in my chest. I asked, where's his mom in all this? My father shrugged, like it was no big deal. She's not in the picture anymore. Haven't seen her in years. I pressed him for details, but he brushed them off. The point is, he's with me now. But with my new relationship, things are complicated. This could work out for everyone. No, I thought, it could work out for you. That was the truth he wasn't saying out loud. I finished my coffee in silence, my mind spinning. This wasn't just about me being angry at my dad. This was about a 7-year-old boy who might be living in a situation that wasn't safe or stable. I didn't know yet what I was going to do, but I knew I wasn't just going to nod and say sure to this insane request. As I stood to leave, my father called after me. Think about it, okay? You be doing the right thing. I walked out without answering. My heart was pounding, and a knot of anger and dread settled in my stomach. I had no idea that this conversation was only the tip of the iceberg, and that the decision I was about to make would change more than just my relationship with him. I couldn't shake the conversation from my mind. For the next few days, I replayed it over and over, trying to figure out if I'd somehow misunderstood him. Maybe there was more to the story. Maybe, against all odds, he actually had a good reason for asking me to take legal responsibility for his son. But every time I went over his words, it became clearer. There was no misunderstanding. He wanted me to adopt Liam so he could date without the baggage of having a young child. It was selfishness in its purest form. 2 days after our meeting, he texted me. So, have you thought about it? Liam really likes video games. I'm sure you two would get along. We can make it easy legally. The casual tone made my blood boil. Make it easy legally? As if transferring guardianship of a human being was like handing over a used car title. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I called my mom. I hadn't told her about the meeting yet because I wasn't sure how she'd react. When I explained everything, she went silent for a moment, and then I heard her take a sharp breath. He hasn't changed, she said flatly. I wish I could say I'm surprised, but I'm not. Don't you dare get pulled into his mess. Hearing that should have been enough to close the door, but something about Liam gnawed at me. I kept thinking about that 7-year-old boy living with the same man who had abandoned me without a second thought. What was his day-to-day life like? Was he safe? Was he cared for? Or was he just another inconvenience waiting to be pushed off onto someone else? The next weekend, my father called again. This time, I answered mostly out of morbid curiosity. Look, he said, sounding impatient, I don't know what's taking you so long. This is a win-win. You get a little brother to care for, Liam gets stability, and I get to move forward with my life. I can even pay you a little each month to help out. That last part almost made me laugh. You mean like child support? I asked. The thing you never paid me or mom? He ignored the jab. Think of it as compensation. You're good with kids. You got a steady job. You're perfect for this. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice even. Where's Liam right now? Home, he said. With you. Not exactly, he admitted. He's with a neighbor until I get back. It was Saturday afternoon. I asked where he was, and he casually replied, out with my girlfriend. We're doing a weekend trip. That was the moment a switch flipped in my brain. This wasn't about finding a better life for Liam. It was about convenience for my father. He was already dumping his kid on other people, so he could do whatever he wanted. I pressed him further. How often do you leave him with someone else? There was a pause. When I need to, he said finally. That was all I needed to hear. My stomach tightened with the same sick, helpless feeling I'd had as a kid when he left me behind. I wasn't just angry anymore, I was worried. Genuinely worried about Liam. I told him I needed to think, but instead of thinking, I started researching. I read up on adoption laws, guardianship, and, most importantly, signs that a child might be in neglect. Every article I read made the pit in my stomach grow deeper. Then I stumbled across something that sealed my decision. In my state, if you suspect a child is being neglected or left without proper care, you can make an anonymous report to Child Protective Services. I wasn't sure if things were that bad yet, but the fact that I even had to consider it said a lot. Before I made any calls, I decided I wanted to see Liam for myself. I texted my father and said I'd like to meet him. He was thrilled, probably thinking I was coming around to his proposal. When I arrived at his place that Sunday, the door was answered not by my father, but by a thin, tired-looking woman I assumed was the neighbor. She introduced herself and explained that my dad had stepped out for a bit and left Liam with her again. Liam came into the room, shy and quiet, clutching a worn-out stuffed dinosaur. His clothes were a little too small, his hair uncombed. But what hit me hardest were his eyes, big, brown, and far older than a 7-year-old should be. He looked at me like he'd already learned not to expect too much from the adults in his life. I sat with him for a while, asked him about school, his favorite games, what he liked to do for fun. He warmed up a little, but every time the conversation drifted toward his dad, he'd shut down. When my father finally strolled in, smelling faintly of alcohol and wearing a smug smile, he said, "So, isn't he great? You'd be perfect for him." In that moment, I knew exactly what I was going to do, and it wasn't going to be what my father expected. The moment my father said, "You'd be perfect for him," I felt something inside me snap. Not in a loud, dramatic way, more like a quiet, internal shift where everything suddenly became crystal clear. This wasn't about family. This wasn't about doing what was best for Liam. This was about my father offloading his responsibility the same way he'd tossed me aside 20 years ago. And I wasn't about to let history repeat itself. I looked at Liam, still clutching that stuffed dinosaur like it was the only safe thing in the room. His small shoulders hunched forward, like he was bracing for whatever might come next. I remember that feeling. I'd lived that feeling. And there was no way in hell I was going to stand by while another child, my own half-brother, went through it. But here's the problem. I didn't know what help looked like yet. Did I take him in like my father wanted? Did I call CPS right away and risk him ending up in foster care? Was there even another family member who could take him? I decided to test my father first, see just how deep his neglect ran. So I asked, keeping my tone neutral, "What's Liam's daily routine like?" He shrugged. School, homework, dinner. What time do you pick him up from school?" I pressed. His eyes darted away. "I usually can't get there, so the neighbor does it. Sometimes he stays over there if I have plans." My blood pressure spiked. "How often is sometimes?" Another shrug. "Couple nights a week." "Look, he's fine. The neighbor's great with kids." I wanted to scream. "A couple nights a week? That's not parenting. That's part-time babysitting with a blood tie." I turned to Liam. "Hey, buddy, what's your favorite dinner your dad makes?" He hesitated, then mumbled, "He doesn't really cook. We order food, or I eat at Mrs. K's." Mrs. K, the neighbor, the woman who had answered the door earlier. The more Liam spoke, the more it became obvious that she was the one actually raising him. I looked back at my father, who was now checking his phone, probably texting his girlfriend. The urge to call him out right there, in front of Liam, was strong, but I knew that wouldn't help. Instead, I played along. "Okay, I'll think about it," I said, standing up. His face lit up. "See? I knew you'd come around." I didn't bother correcting him. I just said goodbye to Liam, promising I'd see him soon, and walked out. The moment I got in my car, I called my mom. "It's worse than I thought," I told her. She sighed heavily. "So what are you going to do?" "I don't know," I admitted. "If I take him in, I'm basically rewarding Dad for being a terrible parent. But if I don't, Liam's still stuck with him, or worse, neglected until something bad happens." That night, I barely slept. My mind kept running through scenarios. In one, I adopted Liam and gave him the life he deserved, but I'd also be taking on a massive responsibility I hadn't planned for. In another, I called CPS and they removed him from my father's custody, possibly placing him in a foster home with strangers. Neither option felt perfect. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a new message from my father. "Just talk to my lawyer friend. Paperwork would be simple. We can get it done in a week if you say yes." A week. Like he was trying to seal some shady deal before I could change my mind. I decided I needed advice from someone who actually understood the system. So I reached out to a friend who worked in social services. I told her the situation, every ugly detail. She didn't sugarcoat it. If he's leaving Liam with neighbors multiple nights a week, not providing meals, and prioritizing his dating life over basic care, that's neglect. CPS exists for exactly this reason. But you have to be prepared for what comes after. If you report it, you might not get to decide where Liam goes. Her words hit hard. If CPS got involved, I couldn't control the outcome. But could I live with myself if I did nothing? That was the moral tug of war. Protect Liam by any means necessary, or protect him my way, even if that meant bending to my father's terms. I thought about the 7-year-old version of me, waiting by the window for a dad who never came home. I thought about how long it took me to realize that it wasn't my fault that I wasn't unlovable, I was just unlucky to have a parent who cared more about himself than his kid. And I realized something. Liam didn't have time for me to hesitate. That night, I made my decision. It wasn't the easy choice. It wasn't the choice that would make my father happy, but it was the one that would let me sleep at night. The next morning, I woke up with my mind made up. I wasn't going to let my father bully me into taking legal responsibility for a child just so he could run off and play bachelor again. But I also wasn't going to sit on my hands and hope Liam turned out okay. If I learned anything from my own childhood, it was that waiting for a bad parent to change is like waiting for a snowstorm in July. It's never going to happen. I dialed the number for Child Protective Services. My hands were shaking, but my voice was steady when I explained the situation. The nights Liam spent with neighbors, the lack of meals, the constant absence of my father. I gave them every detail I could remember. The woman on the line asked a lot of questions. Some were straightforward. Liam's age, school, living arrangements. Others were harder. Has he ever been left alone overnight? Has he shown signs of malnourishment or neglect? I told her what I'd seen and what Liam had told me. She didn't promise immediate action, but she assured me it would be investigated. She also reminded me that my report could remain anonymous, though I knew my father would figure it out. Hanging up, I felt conflicted. Part of me was relieved, like I'd finally taken control of a situation that had been eating me alive. But another part of me was scared. What if CPS took Liam away and I never saw him again? What if the system failed him? 2 days later, my father called. "You called CPS on me," he snapped the moment I answered. I didn't bother denying it. "Liam deserves better than what you're giving him. You had no right." His voice cracked with anger. "He's my son." I let the silence hang for a moment before saying, "Yeah, and I was your kid too. How'd that work out?" For once, he didn't have a comeback. He hung up on me, but not before muttering something about me being dead to him. Honestly, that wasn't much of a loss. A week passed before I heard anything. Then one afternoon, I got a call from the CPS caseworker. They'd visited the home, spoken to the neighbor, and interviewed Liam at school. The findings? My father wasn't meeting basic care requirements. Liam was temporarily placed with the neighbor, Mrs. K, who had already been doing most of the parenting anyway. They were evaluating longer-term options, including possible placement with other relatives. The caseworker asked if I'd be open to being considered. I hesitated. This was the exact situation I'd been trying to avoid, taking on a responsibility I hadn't planned for. But when I pictured Liam's face, I knew I couldn't just walk away. "I want what's best for him," I told her. "If that means he ends up with me, then we'll figure it out." She thanked me, and we ended the call. A few days later, I went to visit Liam at Mrs. K's. He greeted me at the door, still holding that stuffed dinosaur, but this time there was a small smile on his face. We sat on the porch eating popsicles while Mrs. K watered her plants. He told me about a new video game he was playing and how Mrs. K made pancakes for breakfast every morning. I could see the difference already. His shoulders were less tense, his eyes a little brighter. At one point, he looked up and asked, "Are you going to be my sister forever?" The question hit me like a punch to the chest. I smiled and said, "Always." As for my father, I haven't heard from him since that angry phone call. I doubt I will, and that's fine. I'm not losing anything worth keeping. Do I know exactly what the future holds for Liam? No, but I do know he's safe, cared for, and not being treated like a burden to be passed around. That's more than I ever got at his age. Sometimes, I think about how differently things could have gone if I just said yes to my father's request. Maybe he'd still be dumping Liam on neighbors. Maybe Liam would start thinking he wasn't worth keeping, just like I did. And that thought makes me certain I did the right thing. Was it easy? No. Will there be challenges ahead? Absolutely. But for the first time, I feel like I broke the cycle. I don't know if Reddit would call me a hero or a jerk for calling CPS on my own father. But I do know one thing. I'd rather be the villain in his story than let a 7-year-old become another casualty in his selfishness.